Thank you, Tom. Thanks to Karen and our choir. What a beautiful job. Thank you to the musicians. So good to have you guys share with us. So, how does Easter end? How does Easter end? With the letter R. I guess that wasn't the last bad joke after all. How does Easter end? It really is up to each and every one of you. If you read Matthew, Luke, and John, you've got Jesus doing something very different than what Tom just read. Matthew, Luke, and John talk about Jesus popping in and out of rooms and popping in and out of conversations, inviting the disciples to put their hands in the wounds of his side. In the Gospels, we've got the risen Jesus fixing breakfast for his disciples. We've got him walking around, being seen by all sorts of people who know him and who love him. That's Matthew, that's Luke, that's John, but Mark is different. Those 8 verses that Tom read just a moment ago are what scholars and historians believe are the earliest endings for Mark's gospel, and that there were later additions through the lineage of Mark. You see, what we want to learn this morning is that an ending that signals a beginning, that's what Mark offers to us. Rather than victory, Mark's gospel leaves us with this opened tomb, open-ended cliffhanger. Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. Anybody in here ever been that kind of afraid? Not able to comprehend what's going on in your life, not knowing what's next or what it all means? It seems like sort of a strange way to end a faith story, though, doesn't it? An ending that really isn't an ending at all. You see, the story, as Mark writes it, doesn't end with great courage or with great hope. It ends in the midst of fear, with some trembling, some silent running. Now, why in the world would Mark choose to end his gospel that way? It's anybody's guess, really, and so I've got one, and since I have a microphone and I'm up front, I guess you're going to hear my guess of why. You see, Mark was a friend of a man named Peter. Mark O'Mealy sang about him just a few moments ago. Do you remember Peter's situation? Peter, after the death of Christ, some 60 years after, finds himself living in Rome. And if you lived in the 60s after the death of Christ in Rome, you dealt with a lot of persecution. The Christian community was very much threatened. There was great fear and trembling in the Christian community at that time in Rome. In fact, the Emperor Nero had begun to persecute Christians actively. In fact, he accused the Christians in the Roman community of burning down literally a third of the city of Rome. And to make an example of the Christians, he took them and he crucified them on the main thoroughfare through Rome. And as they were being crucified, he ordered them to be set on fire. History tells us that Peter and likely Paul during this time of persecution lost their lives. Can you imagine what it would have been like to be a believer in that day, in that age, in that place? Is it any wonder that the Christian community then was saying to one another, is Jesus really risen? Did that really happen? Because if he has the power over death, we sure could use it. Does Jesus really have resurrection power? Mark's answer to that question is yes. Jesus is no longer in the tomb. Jesus has defeated death. He has risen. But the answer that Mark gives isn't a simple one. Mark makes you work for it. Mark makes you look for it and find it in some unusual places. Look at the young man who announces to the women that Jesus is no longer there. Mark has him described as being dressed in a white robe and still sitting inside the grave, the place of death. This young man wearing an angel's robe, a baptismal robe, glistening white, and yet he's in the midst of a place of death. And in that place of death, he's proclaiming to anyone and everyone who would listen that Jesus Christ has conquered death, and so shall you. He's sitting in that grave. He's sitting in the midst of troubling circumstances, difficult times, just like those persecuted Christians in Rome, the ones who would have first read Mark's gospel. You see, Mark challenges them to believe in the faith that they cling to in the midst of their persecution, in the midst of their difficulties and their struggles, and Mark challenges you and I to do the same. Mark knows that life can be frightening and that we can have times of trembling and that we can run, but we cannot hide. And so he challenges us to believe that Christ has risen. He's risen indeed. And what that is to live life unburied. Do we want to live an unburied life? Several years ago, a woman in my former church, she pulled me aside. She was an older lady, and she had this very sweet kind of voice that she struggled to speak. And so she said to me, "Pastor Brian, I have to tell you about a conversation with my great-grandson." Now, her name was Rachel. At the time that we had this conversation, Rachel was 96 years old. And I'm sharing this with you because I got a phone call last week that Rachel had passed away at the age of 104. If you are a pastor in Florida and you have older folks in your congregation, eventually you have a conversation with one of them and they say, "Pastor, when it's time for me to die, when it's time for my funeral, I'd like for you to do that funeral." It's a privilege to be asked that. Let me tell you about my conversation with Rachel. Rachel said, "Pastor, when I'm 100 years old, I want you to dance with me at my birthday party." That was Rachel. So Rachel came to me with this conversation with her great-grandson, and she said, this is how it went. "Gigi, why do you have so many wrinkles on you?" She said, "Because I'm really old." "Well, Gigi, that's okay, because do you know what happens when you get old?" "What?" "You die and they bury you in the ground. But it's still okay because God comes and unburies you." It's still okay because God comes and unburies you. Folks, that's it. It really is that simple. That is the Easter story. So many of us, myself included, we get buried by the circumstances of our lives. We get overwhelmed. We get afraid. We get frightened. And somehow God comes and tries to unbury us if we'll let him. That's the power of God's love, that he would cross heaven and earth to be with us where we are, to go ahead of us where we are, and to offer to unbury us with the power of his love. There are so many ways that we can get buried in our lives. I was actually on a Zoom call with some other pastors, and I said, "Hey guys, help me with my sermon. list some things that can bury people in their lives, some circumstances that can bury people. And they say, well, there's sorrow and grief, death and loss, fear and anxiety, perfectionism, anger, guilt, regret, resentment, self-hatred. And I was like, okay, guys, I got it. Thank you. Maybe I should zoom in with the Baptists. They sound a little more optimistic than you guys do. The things that we have done that bury us, and the things that we've left undone that bury us. And the truth is that a lot of us live our lives not only expecting to get buried, but believing that we're going to stay buried, that life will never change. But if you believe Mark says that Jesus isn't buried, that the stone has been rolled away. And not only has the stone been rolled away, but he is not here. And the reason he's not here is because he's gone ahead of us to where we are going. All those places that we don't want to go, but we find ourselves in. All those places that sometimes we struggle. Even the joyous places, the promise is that Jesus is there ahead of us. For the disciples, it was Galilee. He's going ahead of you into Galilee, and there you will see him, just as he told you. In other words, he's going to be there because he promised you that he would be. Sometimes we are just way too quick to forget that for every burial in life, there is an Easter. That's what happened for those faithful but defeated women who headed early in the morning to Jesus' tomb. They had no expectation of life. All they were going for, therefore, was to visit death. Mark tells us they were having death conversations. They looked up in the midst of their conversation about who would roll away the stone of death, and they found that it had already been rolled away. If they hadn't shown up, they'd have never known it. Folks, that's why we need to show up in our lives every day. We need to show up in our faith lives every day. Not just on Easter Sunday, but every day. We need to show up. We need to show up so that God can remind us that the stones that cover up the tombs of our lives have been rolled back, and that God is rolling them back on a regular basis. We need to show up every day because sometimes that can happen in an instant, and we don't want to miss it. We need to show up every day in our faith lives because sometimes that is a lifelong journey to discover that Jesus is rolling the stone away from the tombs in our life. We came together here today for this time of worship because whether we know it or not, whether we want to or not, whether we believe it or not, we need to hear this story again and again and again. That's why the Christian year is a circle. It never stops, because these stories we need to remind each other of again and again. We forget. God never intended for Easter to be an event from the past that we celebrate. God's intent for Easter is for it to become the lens through which we see everything in our lives. Easter isn't an event to be celebrated, it's a life to be lived. Getting Jesus out of the tomb wasn't God's ultimate goal of Easter. The goal of Easter is your new life. That's what Jesus went to the cross for, and that's why he's living out ahead of you, because your life matters. What matters the most about Easter is what you and I will do about Easter tomorrow, and the next day, and the day after that. He's going ahead of you, said the young man dressed in the white robe to the women. He's going ahead of us to roll back the stones, to empty out the tombs, to prepare new places, to call us forward into our new lives. And to do that, he uses glorious words. Did you hear how personal the message was from that young man inside the tomb? Go tell the disciples and Peter. The disciples, there are 11 of them, but he says 10 of them, the disciples, and then he says Peter by name. Peter, the one who just 3 days before had denied even knowing Jesus. The one who I'm sure thought that his ministry and his life was over. He heard his name. And Peter. With just those two glorious words, Peter's life and ministry is unburied. Glorious words of hope, words of life, words of resurrection. Friends, it's one thing for us to believe in Jesus, but to know that Jesus believes in us, that is everything. Everything can change because everything has changed, if we choose to allow it to. I want you to do me a favor. For just a minute, I want you to close your eyes, and I want you to think back across your life. And I want you to think about all of the stones in your life that have blocked your way for a time. Stones that got in the way of where you thought you were supposed to go, what you thought you were supposed to do, stones that you believed were dead ends and roadblocks. Think about all of those stones in your life. No future, no way forward, no way to pass. Now I want you to open your eyes. Here you are. In that moment, when you were going through that time with that stone in the way, you thought you'd never get here. And yet here you are. Christ is risen and those stones in your life were removed. Maybe it was in a moment. Maybe it's still in the process of happening. You see, church, God's Easter glory never ends. It just continues to unfold. And that unfolding can begin this morning for every one of us with just some simple steps. Simple to talk about, difficult to live into. But this morning I'd like you to start by just telling Jesus you need him. Maybe you've never had that conversation with Jesus, or maybe you have at some season in your life and you and Jesus had a relationship, but somehow you've gotten away from that. Today I want you to tell him that you need him. And the second thing is to begin to get to know him. Better and better every day. Spend some time in the Word. Not hours, just time. Every day, a little bit more, you and Jesus getting to know each other. And the third thing is to let others help. I'm not talking about just putting more people in your life. I'm challenging you to start putting your life into people. Finding relationships that will bless you and challenge you. Some relationships of accountability and do some serving with some people around you. That's what I call an unburied life, and that is what Easter is all about. Let me tell you, God doesn't care where you've come from. God just wants to be a part of where you're going. God doesn't care your pedigree. He's not interested in your resume. God knows you, and he wants you to know him. Maybe you were close for a time and you're not now. You've drifted away. God wants you to come home. There is no one in this world that will ever love you more than Jesus Christ does. You matter so much to God that he crossed heaven and earth to get to where you are. Maybe you found your way here this morning and you're barely hanging on. Discouraged, challenged, afraid. You've got pressure, you've got stress. It's all building up and it all feels overwhelming. If that is you, I want to tell you that God brought you here this morning because he wants to begin to unbury your life. Because of Easter, we don't have to live afraid. Because of Easter, we don't have to hold back. Because of Easter, we can offer God not only our best, but our all. That's life unburied, and that's the life that he wants for you and I. The glorious Easter sun has risen fully in the sky, and it reveals to us that the stone is already rolled away. And Christ is risen, and he has gone ahead of us to wherever it is that we will go. And folks, if Christ is risen, then so are we. And that's the truth. Would you pray with me, please? God, we thank you for this beautiful morning, this time to be together, to sing your praises, to read your word, to hear what it is to live life unburied. We ask that you would help us as we go from this place to live in such a way that we become lovers of life. Not just the life of living and breathing, but the life that you give us, the breath that you place within us. The life that reminds us that always, wherever we go, you are there ahead of us. And because you are there, we are never alone. Remind us again and again and again of the story that your Son indeed has risen. The stone is rolled away and the tomb is empty, so our lives are full. Amen.